Hi guys, my name's Ian McNeil. I'm CEO of Slytherin Matrix Games. I'd like to have been there talking to you in person today, but unfortunately I'm on a plane right now, so I've had to record my presentation, and this is my first attempt at doing that, so please be gentle. So a bit of background about us. My presentation is about war games for command decision support, and I think there's a huge opportunity here. Our background is in commercial games, and so we come at things very differently to traditional defense companies and the military. So we have two brands. Our Slytherin brand is our more mainstream brand, focused at consumer games with licenses such as Starship Troopers or Battlestar Galactica that you can see here. And then we have our Matrix brand, which is much more hardcore war games, so realistic simulations, and that's where we have a crossover into the defense space. So we've got about 300 games covering all platforms and various different genres, but they're all subgenres of strategy and war games. So for us, it started about 6 years ago when we had a phone call from the Pentagon out of the blue, which was a bit of a surprise. And we didn't really take it seriously, but it turned out it was the Pentagon, and it was someone from the Secretary of the Air Force group over there. And they wanted to use one of our simulations called Harpoon for naval analysis and various other things. Actually, it wasn't naval analysis, it was the Air Force. But they wanted to use one of our simulations. What we did was we redirected them to a more modern game called Command, and we showed them that, and they were blown away by what it could do and how things had moved on. So inside the defense system, they'd had lots of simulations, really, really detailed, some very good simulations, but very specific. So you might have a really detailed simulation of how a missile flies out, or what happens to the parts of an inside of a tank when a missile impacts, and how the shrapnel splinters. But what they didn't really have was a good simulation that pulled it all together in a holistic way, and that's what we do. Everything we do is that big holistic picture. So since that initial approach, we've been working with quite a few different people. So Air Force Research Lab was one of our first clients. They were using Command to look at early prototyping to help direct funding. So they had a way of comparing between two technologies that were very different. Something might fly faster or further or give you fuel efficiency, and they needed ways to compare the operational benefits of these different technologies. And so they wanted a tool that could narrow things down and then let them look at it in more detail in their specific simulations. Air Mobility Command, they're one of our biggest clients. They use Command for all the fuel planning they're doing with tanker operations. DSTL in the UK, they are doing a lot with a number of our different simulations. US Marine Corps, we've got a big contract with them at the moment to do work, and that's why I can't be there today. I'm off to do a presentation to the Marine Corps. The Air Force Research Laboratory have a branch at Eglin, the Munitions Directorate. We have a Phase 2 SIBA going on with them. Luftwaffe, they use Command now to train every officer coming through into the Luftwaffe. And so this is just an example of some of our clients, but we have scattering of clients across the world and different departments around the militaries everywhere. So to give an example of the kinds of decisions that Command is feeding into, it's partly training, but on the analysis side, we know that it's been used to wargame the Arrow hypersonic missile system and the Iron Dome systems. That's not to say that Command's the only piece of research or information feeding into this, but it's part of the decision-making process, and these are billion-dollar decisions. So looking at the games that we actually have that have crossed over into defense, three good examples are Combat Mission, which is a full 3D tactical simulation, ground-based. That's being widely used by DSTL to do research. We have Command, which is an operational scale physics-based simulation down to the entity and component level. That's being used widely across the world. That's our kind of flagship professional title. And then Flashpoint Campaigns, which is a bit more of an abstract simulation. So there's hexes, there's counters, there's a really innovative OODA loop system that makes command and control very interesting. And that's in use with the US Army and DSTL. We've got a number of other games where there's increasing interest in using them professionally, but those are the core ones currently. So that's a bit of background about us. Now moving on to how is the training currently delivered? The current training is really focused on the pilot, the driver, the sailor, infantryman. It's very much about training the guys on the ground in the front line. And when you talk about training, everyone sees in their head this virtual reality You see people wearing these headsets and using things like VBS. And the reason that these guys get the focus of the training is, one, because they're more numerous. So if you've got to train a battalion, the vast majority of people are going to be these frontline guys on the ground, not your senior commanders. But also, it's easier to train them, and we have the tools already in place to train them. So it's a simpler problem to solve, and they're more numerous, and so they tend to get much more of the attention. So how does the training work for our more senior commanders? At the moment, there's little to no simulation training for these guys. They may take a course of action, plan it on paper. Rarely they'll get to see the results of their plan. If they do, it's usually because there'll be an SME with them that will, or a military advisor that will tell them this is what would have happened, but they don't really get to try it out against a thinking enemy. They may get the chance to do manual wargaming, which is very useful. Manual wargames can be great, but they can be quite time consuming. So it takes a lot of time to set up. Each of the players in the game is a human. There are umpires, moderators, all that kind of thing. So the manpower required to run a manual war game is significant. So whilst very useful, it's not the kind of thing you can do very regularly. And they tend to get to do this maybe not once in the year, or maybe up to 2 times if they're lucky. And the more senior they are, the less opportunity they get to do these things. So you've also got things like the command and staff trainer, which again is a really useful tool, but it's very limited access. It's the kind of thing you might get to do once, twice a year. Very useful, but it's very expensive again to set things up, very time consuming. So there's big issues of scalability, and there's also issues of how public they are. So when you're in these large games with lots of people, everything you do is being scrutinized by the umpire, by other players. There's not much opportunity to really experiment and try the strange radical ideas because you've got career prospects on the line. You can't afford to do something radical in case it goes wrong and you look stupid. So it really discourages experimentation, and these are the kind of things that really encourage learning and new tactics and new ideas. And due to all the cost issues just mentioned, you also have repeatability. So to embed lessons and for learning to really sink in, you have to do the reps. You have to do things time and again, and that's why all the training exercises in other fields have you doing things many, many times for the lessons to sink in. But because you get the chance to do this kind of thing so rarely, it just doesn't have the ability to sink in to the depth that we need it to. One of the other things that I forgot to mention is that the training is often done in a layered way. So you'll be training a platoon, a company, a battalion, a division, whatever it is. When you're doing that kind of training, you're really training the people at the bottom to the middle. The guys at the top, they might be learning some of the procedural work, but they're not really getting the chance to try out tactics. They're trying to deliver training for the more numerous people below them, and so often their exercises are on rails to make sure that the more numerous people below them get the training outcomes that they're looking for. So whenever you're talking about these trainings in layers, to me, I don't think you're training the senior commanders in that exercise. They're the ones that are really not getting much out of it. And so to train a battalion commander, you need to be doing a brigade or a division sized exercise. So why is it important that we train these guys? So it's common sense that the more senior a commander, the more people they have under their command, and so the more people their decisions are affecting. So the decisions made by our more senior commanders affect the tactical situation that the junior commanders and the frontline guys find themselves in. History shows us time and again that good military leaders can really win battles against the odds, and bad military leaders can throw away huge advantages. So military leaders act as a force multiplier for good or for bad. As a result, you can see that senior leaders have more impact on the battlefield than junior officers. So the conclusion is logically that it's more important to train your senior leaders than your junior officers and your frontline troops. But that isn't what actually happens. Let's look at some examples. All military leaders study history, know the stories of Hannibal, and it's a good example. At the Battle of Cannae, Hannibal was outnumbered and outclassed. Man for man, his infantry were just no match for Roman legionaries, and he was also outnumbered. And his only advantage was that the Roman cavalry was notoriously weak, and he had an advantage there. So Hannibal's battle plan revolved around this. He knew his infantry in the middle would give ground, and he hoped his cavalry would push the enemy back. and everything went as planned, and the Romans end up being totally enveloped, and it ended up being the one of the biggest single days of slaughter until World War One. But this isn't an isolated incident. History repeats itself time and again. You've got Napoleon at Austerlitz. You've got Manstein in France. At the time of the invasion, the German tanks were no match at all for the French tanks and couldn't hurt them frontally. So in a head-on fight, the Germans would have lost. But Manstein's plan involved sucking the British and French troops into the Low Countries and surrounding them and cutting them off from supply, where he could defeat them piecemeal and make them easy targets. Similarly, bad decisions can result in massive failure. So the French Grand Army under Napoleon was one of the greatest forces to be put together in history, and he completely threw it away by invading Russia. And again, Hitler repeated the mistake by invading Russia during World War II. While we normally just supply our software to the customers and they use it for analysis or training, we also sometimes provide wargaming services for clients. And it's given us some really interesting insights into the kind of things that players do in games. So these are serving military personnel, so they should know what they're doing. But what you find is that while there's usually a pretty good familiarity with blue forces, they sometimes know a little bit about allied systems. They rarely know much about red systems. And so wargaming is a great way to familiarize yourselves with the capabilities of your troops and the enemies. There's also a lot of basic mistakes being made in some of these games. For example, we had one game where B-2 stealth bombers were being flown over to a target, but they'd forgotten that B-2s can still be seen, they're not invisible. And so when you fly them during the day, you're vulnerable to visual identification, which happened and they got shot down. Or no thought of capacity. There was an airport that had around 300 aircraft trying to land on it at one time. Or launching your AWACS after all of your other aircraft are in the air, so the others had to be refueled before they could launch off of their operation, or they were engaged before they had any airborne early warning up in the air. So you see lots of simple mistakes being made, and you see the light bulb moments when students see the mistakes they've made, and you hope at least that these lessons have really sunk in a bit more than they would have done if you'd seen something on a spreadsheet. What are the problems with the current training? We've already mentioned that there's far too much focus on the frontline soldier. Clearly these guys need to be trained, but currently it's at the expense of the more senior commanders because all of the resources are put into them. We need to develop systems to allow our commanders and their commanders to train digitally so that they can do it at their own time, in their own speed, and in private. It gives them the chance to do that experimentation, do these reps, get the learning embedded, but also to try experiment new things, take risks they couldn't do if they're being looked at publicly. And if they can do it in their own time, digitally, in the evenings, at home, weekends, whenever, then you can try and build it into the normal routine without taking resources away and time away from other tasks. So there's this misconception that by making graphics more detailed and moving to augmented reality or virtual reality, there'll be benefits for everyone. And whilst this can be true for the soldier on the front line, it's a lot less true for a company commander or someone making operational decisions. So great 3D graphics and VR, like you can get from VBS, are great if you're that guy driving the tank or operating the machine gun. But if you're that company commander, it's much more useful to have a view, something like Combat Mission, where you can get an overview of what's happening. And the 3D is important, but it's not as vital as it would have been to someone there on the ground. And then you move further out to an operational commander. You really need a view more like Command, which is much more iconic. 3D here would be much a hindrance rather than a help. And so it's all about making sure that we are developing the right tools to embed the right learning and get the best results for our troops and our trainees. Recently, I saw an article on LinkedIn, I think it was, and someone was talking about this new system they developed. It was a full VR system related to missile control and early warning. And they showed this 3D view of in virtual reality of how you would look at this missile and you could see it coming towards you and how you would launch missiles out in VR. And to me, the system was ridiculous. The kind of information you need for a missile defense system is not the kind of information you can get from a VR view in 3D of a missile on the landscape. All of these engagements are happening well beyond visual range, and they need to be dealt with in much more iconic ways. And the 3D was just a distraction and just a gimmick. But it's a common problem using 3D and VR as a gimmick to try and make something else look more useful. But unfortunately, it works because a lot of people are impressed by graphics. So one of the things we're finding is that we're having to make our detailed, accurate simulations prettier to appeal to people higher up the command chain, because they don't necessarily understand the detail of what's happening and they're impressed by the visuals. So moving on to why some of these problems are there. So one of these problems is due to stovepiping. So each service has its own pots of money, its own models, its own funding pipelines, and its own objectives. And often they're not allowed to look outside of their own particular domain, and they can tread on other people's toes if they try to. So it can be quite hard to create those multi-domain simulations that the modern battlefield really demands. So what we need to do is look at more cross-service and cross-level and command structure projects to really push forward the development of simulations that can deliver to the future multi-domain battlefield, which is going to be increasingly complicated and increasingly integrated. In a recent discussion I was having with a modeling and simulation team, I was talking about this issue of training the more senior commanders, and they told me that wasn't something they should be looking at because this was a C2 problem, and the C2 people should be building those simulations. But C2 people don't build simulations. They use simulations provided by the simulation and modeling people, and so everyone's kind of passing the buck saying it's not their thing to think about. And so us being on the commercial side leaves us a huge opportunity to come in and deliver these tools that they need, but no one's willing to kind of get together and make right now. So the problem needs to be looked at holistically across domain and across scale. So that brings us into now, what can we do better? The future battle space is going to be increasingly complicated. The screenshot here is Command just importing some live commercial traffic around the port of Singapore, and you can just start to get an idea of how utterly overwhelming the amount of information that's going to be available. This is just civilian traffic. Once you take something like this, and then you start to layer on the relevant military information on top, it very quickly becomes clear how the human brain just can't process it. In combination with that, you've got changes in technology where all of our sensors are going to be working cross-domain. Everything is becoming more interlinked. The land systems are going to be reporting to air and navy, the air systems to land and navy, and vice versa, and everyone's talking. So the amount of information is just going to be utterly enormous. Add on to that, the pace of the future battle space is going to be increasingly fast. We have stealth technologies, meaning that enemies are detected at much shorter ranges. We have hypersonic missiles, meaning that missile flyouts are much quicker. You have hypersonic glide vehicles. Your engagement times are going to be much, much shorter. And the amount of entities and information you've got to deal with is going to be much, much higher. And so it becomes a situation that the human brain clearly can't deal with, and we need to have tools to support that. So these tools are going to have to do things. They're going to have to parse the information. We're going to have to start using AI to rationalize this and bring it down to a point where all of the background information is kind of hidden away and the relevant information is highlighted. And then in addition to that, we're going to need tools to suggest courses of action, because the response times are going to be so short that really in situations you might just have enough time to kind of authorize an AI plan rather than come up with the plan entirely yourself. And so they're building these tools for the future. Command decision support tools are going to be increasingly important. And we have a great chance to test these command decision support tools out in virtual simulations. And it's possible that the tools being deployed live on the front line could be very similar to the tools that we develop for our simulation and training needs, or even identical. We might find that there's an increasing convergence here where the tools to train and the tools being used operationally are becoming increasingly close, because everything is becoming more digital. The whole environment is becoming more digital. In conclusion, we need to stop focusing on the frontline soldier. It's not to say they shouldn't be trained. It's just that we need to put much more emphasis on training the more senior commanders, and how that's funded or how that's achieved, I don't have an answer for that, but it's clear that we need to do it. In every other profession, we accept that practice makes perfect. You wouldn't let a doctor operate on you if it was the first time he tried it, and yet we expect our military commanders to go into the field with very little chance of actually fighting a real engagement. They haven't really had a chance to practice it properly. They get the chance to rehearse the mechanics of how you deliver a plan once it's been given to you by somebody else, but there's very little chance to actually come up with that plan. That's the area where we need more opportunity to experiment and learn. And to do this, we need to focus on creating tools to deliver that training. So there's a huge opportunity here to create digital tools to let people train in their own time at their own pace. And that's where I think that we should really be focusing. And like I say, I think it's a huge opportunity, and there could be a relatively cheap way to dramatically improve the performance of the future force. At this point, I would be handing over to the moderators to ask me some questions. But unfortunately, as I'm not there, I can't do that. So let's assume you all agree with everything I say and think it's a wonderful idea. One of the questions I've had before about this is, um, okay, we want to train our more senior commanders. How do we make them do it? Um, who's going to force them to study? Who's going to go and tell them that they haven't been trained properly? They aren't ready for the fight. Um, that's not my problem, so feel free to discuss. And if you've got any other questions, please do get in touch. There's a contact page at the end with information on how to get in touch with us, and we'd be happy to talk to you. Thanks very much.